This one's called The Seal Catcher and the Merman. This is the last one, I think, by Elizabeth Grierson in the book. Once upon a time, there was a man who lived not very far from John O'Groat's house, which is, as everyone knows, is the farthest point of Scotland. He lived in a little cottage by the seashore and made his living by catching seals and selling the fur, which in those days was very valuable. He earned a good deal of money in this way, for these creatures used to come out of the sea in large numbers and lie on the rocks near his house, basking in the sunshine. So that was not difficult to creep up behind them and kill them. Some of those seals were larger than others, and the country people used to call them roni and whisper that they were not seals at all, but mermen and merwomen who came from a country of their own, far down under the ocean, who assumed this disguise in order that they might pass through the water and come up to breathe the air of the earth of ours. But the seal catcher only laughed at them and said that those seals were most worth killing, for their skins were so big and he got an extra price for them. Now it chanced one day, when he was pursuing his calling, that he stabbed a seal with his hunting knife, and whether the stroke had not been sure enough or not, I cannot say, but with a loud cry of pain the creature slipped off the rock and into the sea, and disappeared under the water, carrying the knife along with it. The seal catcher, much annoyed at his clumsiness, and also the loss of his knife, went home to dinner in a very downcast frame of mind. On his way he met a horseman, who was so tall and so strange looking, and who rode on such a gigantic horse that he stopped and looked at him in astonishment, wondering who he was and from what country he came. The stranger stooped also and asked him his trade. On hearing that he was a seal catcher, he immediately ordered a great number of sealskins. The seal catcher was delighted, for such an order meant a large sum of money to him. But his face fell when the horseman added that it was absolutely necessary that the skins should be delivered that evening. "I cannot do it," he said, "for the seals will not come back to the rocks again until tomorrow morning." "I can take you to a place where there are a number of seals," answered the stranger, "if you will mount behind me on my horse and come with me." The seal catcher agreed to this and climbed up behind the rider, who took his bridle rein, and off the great horse galloped at such a pace that he had much ado to keep his seat. On and on they went, flying like the wind, until at last they came to the edge of a huge precipice, the face of which was sheer down to the sea. Here the mysterious horseman pulled up his steed with a jerk. "Get off now," he said shortly. The seal catcher did as he was bid, and when he found himself safe on the ground, he peeped cautiously over the edge of the cliff to see if there were any seals lying on the rocks below. To his astonishment, he saw below him no rocks, only the blue sea, which came right up to the foot of the cliff. "Where are the seals that you spoke of?" he asked anxiously, wishing that he had never set out of such a rash adventure. "You will see presently," answered the stranger, who was attending to his horse's bridle. The seal catcher was now thoroughly frightened, for he felt sure that some evil was about to befall him, and in such a lonely place he knew that it would be useless to cry out for help. And it seemed as if his fears would prove only too true, for the next moment the stranger's hand was laid upon his shoulder, and he felt himself being hurled bodily over the cliff. And then he fell with a splash into the sea. He thought that his last hour had come, and he wondered how anyone could commit such a wrong deed upon an innocent man. But to his astonishment, he found that some change must have come over him, for instead of being choked by the water, he could breathe quite easily. And he and his companion, who was still close at his side, seemed to be sinking as quickly down through the sea as they had flown through the air. Down and down they went, nobody knows how far, till at last they came to a huge arched door, which appeared to be made of pink coral, studded over the cockle shells. It opened of its own accord, and when they entered, they found themselves in a huge hall, the walls of which formed of mother of pearl, and the floor which was of sea sand, smooth and firm and yellow. The hall was crowded with occupants, but they were seals, not men, and when the seal catcher turned to his companion to ask him what it all meant, he was aghast to find that he too had assumed the form of a seal. He was still more aghast when he caught sight of himself in a large mirror that hung on the wall, and saw that he also no longer bore the likeness of a man, but was transformed into a nice, hairy brown seal. "Oh, woe's me," he said to himself. "Through no fault of mine, this artful stranger has laid some baneful charm upon me, and in this awful guise will I remain for the rest of my natural life?" At first, none of the huge creatures spoke to him. For some reason or other, they seemed to be very sad, and moved gently about the hall, talking quietly and mournfully to one another, or lay sadly upon the sandy floor, wiping big tears from their eyes with their soft, furry fins. But presently they began to notice him, and to whisper to him and to one another, and presently his guide moved away from him and disappeared through a door at the end of the hall. When he returned, he held a huge knife in his hand. "Did you ever see this before?" he asked, holding it out to the unfortunate seal catcher, who to his horror recognised it as his own hunting knife with which he had struck the seal in the morning, and which had been carried off by the wounded animal. At the sight of it, he fell upon his face and begged for mercy, for he at once came to the conclusion that the inhabitants of the cavern, enraged at the harm which had been wrought upon their comrade, had in some magic way contrived to capture him and to bring him down to their subterranean abode, in order to work their vengeance upon him by killing him. But instead of doing so, they crowded round him, rubbing their soft noses against his fur to show their sympathy, and implored him not to be afraid, for no harm would befall him, and they would love him in all their lives if he would only do what they asked of him. "Tell me what you ask," the seal catcher said, "and I will do it if it lies within my power." "Follow me," answered his guide, and he led the way to the door through which he had disappeared when he went to seek the knife. The seal catcher followed him, and there, in a smaller room, he found a great brown seal lying on a bed of pale pink seaweed, with a gaping wound in his side. "That is my father," said his guide, "whom you wounded this morning," thinking that he was one of the common seals who live in the sea, instead of a merman who has speech and understanding, as you mortals have. "I brought you here to bind up his wounds, for no other hand than yours can heal him." "I have no skill in the art of healing," said the seal catcher, astonished at the forbearance of these strange creatures, for whom he had so unwittingly wronged. "But I will bind up the wound to the best of my power, and I am only sorry that it was at my hands that it was caused." He went over to the bed, and stooping over the wounded merman, washed and dressed the hurt as well as he could, and touch of his hands appeared to work like magic, for no sooner had he finished than the wound seemed to deaden and die, leaving only a scar, and the old seal sprang up as well as ever. Then there was a great rejoicing throughout the whole palace of the seals. They laughed and they talked, and they embraced each other in their own strange way, crowding round their comrade and rubbing their noses against him, as it was to show him how delighted they were at his recovery. But all this while the seal catcher stood alone in a corner, with his mind filled with dark thoughts. For although he saw now that they had no intention of killing him, he did not relish the prospect of spending the rest of his life in the guise of a seal fathoms deep under the ocean. But presently, to his great joy, his guide approached him and said, "Now you are at the liberty to return home to your wife and children. I will take you to them, but only on one condition." "What is it?" asked the seal catcher eagerly, overjoyed at the prospect of being restored safely to the upper world and his family. "That you will take a solemn oath never to wound a seal again. That will I do, right gladly, the seal catcher replied, for although the promise meant giving up his means of livelihood, he felt that if only he regained his proper shape, he could always turn his hand to do something else. So he took the required oath with all due solemnity, holding up his fin as he swore, and all the other seals crowded round him as a witness. And a sigh of relief went through the halls when the words were spoken, for he was the most famous seal catcher in the north. Then he bade the strange company farewell, and accompanied by his guide, passed once more through the outer doors of coral, and up and up and up through the shadowy green water, until it began to grow lighter and lighter, and at last they emerged into the sunshine of the earth. Then, with one spring, they reached the top of the cliff, where the great black horse was waiting for them, quietly nibbling the green turf. When they left the water, their strange disguise dropped from them, and they were now, as they had been before, a plain seal catcher and a tall, well-dressed gentleman in riding clothes. "Get up behind me," said the latter, as he swung himself into the saddle. The seal catcher did as he bid, taking tight hold of his companion's coat, for he remembered how nearly he had fallen off on previous journey. Then it all happened as it happened before. The bridle was shaken, and the horse galloped off, and it was not too long before the seal catcher found himself standing in the safety before his own garden gate. He held out his hand to say goodbye, but as he did, the stranger pulled out a huge bag of gold and placed it in it. "You've done your part of the bargain. We must do ours," he said. "Men shall never say that we took away an honest man's work without giving him some compensation for it. And here is what will keep you in comfort to your life's end." Then he vanished, and when the astonished seal catcher carried the bag into his cottage and turned the gold out onto the table, he found that the stranger had said was true, and that he would be a rich man for the remainder of his life.